Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and welcome back to my channel, and today I'm bringing you my March wrap-up, like part 1. So as I haven't really been reading a whole lot this year, I didn't anticipate reading so much in March that I felt like I should do 2 wrap-up videos, but here we are. I participated in buzzwordathon, bookoplathon, and I had quite a few books that I also read this month. And so I thought I would split my wrap-up into 2 and do like half the books during this video, and then the other half were in the next video, and that one will have like my stats, my like breakdown of the ratings I gave and how many pages I read total, just to potentially keep this from being like, you know, an hour long, potentially. It's not exactly split evenly, but it's fine. So the first books I read were for the buzzwordathon, and the theme or the buzzword was time. So the first book I read for that was The Fire This Time, edited by Jesmyn Ward. So this is a collection of essays that sort of details racism and race in America and the kind of reactions to it. It's an amazing collection, and I feel like Jesmyn Ward did such a great job like collecting different voices and different writing styles and different like points of view and different things being said, and it was really compelling to read them all together. I loved so many of them, and I just thought they were really fantastic, which was great. This was a nonfiction, so I have a really hard time figuring out how best to rate it, so I think I'm going to end up giving it 4 stars, as just it was a very solid collection. I feel like for the subject matter it was an easier read compared to other nonfictions I've read, where I was very compelled and I was drawn into each and every essay that was written. And so I really loved this one, and I would highly recommend everyone pick this one up. So the next book I read was The Psychology of Time Travel by Kate Mascarenhas. This book was... So this was sort of a multiple point of view, multiple timelines / moments in time story that really sort of shows how interwoven everyone is once time travel becomes a thing. So the story sort of starts in 1960 or in the 1960s with the 4 women who basically pioneered time travel, and unfortunately one of them, Barbara, suffers a sort of mental breakdown in some ways after time traveling for the first time, and is ultimately ousted from the company, ousted from the world, and cut off from her friends as well. So she's forced to basically live a normal existence with her husband and kid, and never is allowed back into the time travel world. She misses it, she misses her friends, and does ultimately, when this novel is starting, she's trying to get back to that world. The other narrator, or another point of view we're following, is Ruby, who is Barbara's granddaughter, who doesn't really know or understand anything to do with the time travel aspect, but she basically receives a letter from the future-ish that details an unknown woman who was killed, and Ruby assumes it means it's her grandmother, and so she's trying to figure out a way to stop it from happening and or solve whatever is happening. And that's one of the main points of view that we're following. The other main point of view happens about 1.5 years after that point, and it follows Odette, who also doesn't know anything about time travel, but she walks in on the unknown murders type of thing. So she walks in, she becomes somewhat of a witness, and is drawn into this story and into the world of the time traveling. And so it's kind of 2 very distinct parallel timelines happening, of where we're discovering Ruby's descent into the time travel world and Odette's descent into the time travel world, while also jumping back in the past to watch how everything played out once Barbara was ousted from the company. When she was ousted, Margaret was able to take over, and she really cultivated this very intensive, cavalier and callous way of looking at life and death for her employees, and creates this sort of culture of hazing to maintain that sort of separation, and how life and death doesn't really affect people who time travel in the same way it affects other people. I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was so good. I was so enraptured. Like I loved every minute of it. I thought it was so entertaining. Even the multiple points of view and the different moments in the timeline, it was still easy to follow. in the sense of there were ultimately just the two main timelines we were following, and all the extra little details just were sort of just there to enhance the characters and flesh them out a little bit more. So I absolutely loved this book. I ended up giving it 5 stars. I felt like the writing was fantastic. The interwovenness of the stories and the characters' lives was very, very good. I felt like each of the characters were distinctive enough that I could keep them separate even throughout the entire time traveling aspect. So I absolutely loved this book. Thought it was fantastic. The last book I read for the buzzwordathon was the This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal, El-Mohtar, and Max Gladstone. This book is basically the story of Red and Blue, 2 women who work on opposite sides of this time war that we don't fully know what's going on, just that each side has different things that they're trying to put in the timeline or take out of the different timelines, and these 2 women sort of meet while on assignment and start sending each other letters and eventually sort of fall in love throughout the letter writing. This one was a little bit tricky for me to get into. I had a really hard time with about the first 2/3 of the novel. I felt like I couldn't keep Red and Blue separately, and I felt like the world was so different from the world that we have, and I couldn't really figure out what was going on, and it was very confusing for me to pick up on as I read. And so I really struggled with the first like 2/3 or so. However, once you get to that last third of the book where it sort of feels like you're zooming out and you're finally able to see the full picture versus like the 2 or 3 pieces that are in front of you. And so that really helped me appreciate the book and appreciate the story that was being told, and being able to see all the pieces working together to create like the full picture was fantastic. So because I had such a hard time with the first 2/3 of the book, I'm only gonna, this one is like a solid 3.5 stars for me. I think the star rating could go up if you reread it, because I do think this has like enormous reread value, because now that you know all of the pieces, you might be able to see them easier. But this was a 3.5 star for me. So the next books I read during the 48-hour bookoplathon event hosted by Becca from Becca and the Books, which was an incredibly fun event, and I ended up reading 7.5 books for it. I'm only doing a couple of those books during this wrap up because I just don't have the energy to do all of that. So the first book I want to talk about is Truthwitch by Susan Dennard. So this is the first time I've ever reading this series, and it sort of is a YA fantasy that follows these different characters as their lives are sort of intertwined. So Safi and Isolde, they are thread sisters, like best friends. They care about each other a lot, and they are ultimately on the run because Safi ends up being betrothed to the Emperor, and she has no interest in that. So they sort of go on the run to try and escape that. While they're on the run, they run across Prince Merrick, who's a prince from a neighboring kingdom, who was hired and contracted to transport Safi to a different area, where she would be safe and unharmed and out of the Emperor's reach. Merrick has a thread brother who is Cullen, and they are, again, like best friends. It's like a higher category than best friends, but they're best friends. And they're working together to try to bring some sort of peace to their people, because they were caught up in this war 20 years ago and their lands were basically destroyed during it. Merrick is also fighting against his sister, who is trying to... she's more concerned with the sort of glories of war in some ways, and he's just trying, while Merrick is trying to kind of find a way to prosper with their people. On top of all of that, we have Edouan, who is a blood witch, which means he can scent certain witches and he can follow them. And he was hired by the Emperor to sort of find Safi and bring her back to him. Because Safi is incredibly coveted because she is a truth witch, which basically means she can tell when people are lying or telling the truth. That's one of the main reasons why the Emperor wants her. So Edouan is looking for Safi, and he ends up teaming up with Leopold, who is the Emperor's brother and one of Safi's friends, and they have these moments that feel like there should be something there. I know that there's not, but it's just a really interesting dynamic, and I feel like that's one of the best things of this book, is that the different dynamics that each of the characters have with other characters is very intriguing, it's very interesting, and it's all very different from each other, which I find really, really fascinating. I also really loved the sort of political intrigue that was included in this book and the different connections between all of the characters. So it's just really interesting how they're all sort of tied together. My biggest frustrations or cons about this book was, one, Eidolon. If I've been saying Eidolon, I think it's Eidolon. I'm so sorry. Just ignore that. The sort of Eidolon and Leopold potential that I know is not going to go anywhere. There's just a line that Leopold has to him, which is this idea of like blood witches are considered demonic, and Leopold is like, you're not the monster that they think you are. And to me that is like peak romance, and I know it's not going anywhere, so I have to just let that go. But the other problem I have is that this story is very much Sophia or Safi centric, and she for me was the worst character of all of them. She's very much the chosen one. She plays into the YA trope of being like bratty, and I don't particularly find that compelling to read, especially when you have all these other characters that have such a deeper story going on. I didn't hate her by any means, I still enjoyed the story, but she was kind of the biggest letdown for me in it. I will be reading the sequel though, so that's all I got. So for Truthwitch, I ended up giving it 3.5 stars because I did really like it. I did really end up liking it. It's better than a 3-star, but I don't think it's a 4-star for me. So I don't know how I'm gonna be dealing with these half stars, but I'll figure that out as I go. But I did enjoy it, and it was good. It just wasn't amazing for me personally. The next thing I read was a comic collection, which was the Unworthy Thor collection by Jason Aaron. This is sort of dealing with, this is sort of setting up to / immediately following the story of the female Thor, which I think is called the Mighty Thor, I think. Don't quote me on that. And so this happens right after Thor loses his hammer and is sort of plagued with insecurities and doubts and feels unworthy and can no longer lift his hammer. And so it's him trying to fight that and get back to being worthy of the hammer, and ultimately deciding like whether or not he should be worthy. And it's really interesting because it deals with this idea of like, just because he's a god doesn't mean he's automatically worthy, or does he still have to work for it? Should he just accept that he's worthy, or should he wait for someone better than him? It's very interesting. And I really loved it. I thought it was a really good collection, and I'm super excited that I was able to read it, and I absolutely loved it. I gave this 4 stars as well because I thought the story was so good, and I really just enjoyed the whole thing. So the next book I read was The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi. So I honestly wasn't sure what to expect when I picked up this book because it is a novella and it's very short, and I've heard a lot of really good things about this book, but I've also heard some things that were slightly negative, so I was really curious going into it what I was going to feel. This was so different than what I thought it was going to be. So this is basically Rabbit, a handmaiden to a former empress, detailing her story and how she became a handmaiden to the empress and one of the empress's favorites, to like a young girl now that she was an older woman. And it really follows like the Empress's Inyo and how their relationship played out, and basically the idea of neither of them had a whole lot of control or power in their own lives and the things that they were doing. And it's a very intriguing and stark sort of contrast to the typical fantasies that we see, where we're seeing it from the eyes of the sort of usually ignored parts of these fantasy worlds, you know, the servants, the maids. And so I thought this was really, really good, and I really enjoyed the writing style and the idea that Rabbit was trying to lead the young girl who was listening to the sort of answers that were a critique of the like imperialism and capitalism and the sort of monarchy in a sense. So ultimately I ended up giving this book 4 stars because it was really enjoyable, and I really liked how it focused a lot on the character of Rabbit and her specific story and her specific life that she has lived, and I think that worked really, really well for this fantasy. And then the last book that I read that I'm going to talk about in this wrap-up is Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This was a reread for me because I absolutely loved this book and this series, and I'm super excited to read the newest one that like just came out. And as it fit a bookoplathon prompt, I did a sort of impromptu reread of the first two before I read the third one. So this details Chloe and Red's sort of relationship. Red is getting out of a sort of abusive and toxic situation and is trying to kind of get back to his life and what he wants. And Chloe has had a sort of near-death experience and actually wants to go out and enjoy her life and live her life. And so they sort of team up to work through Chloe's Get a Life list, which is super funny. I love Chloe. She's so cute. I absolutely love this book. I think it is so incredibly fun, and I really love this book. I think this is like one of the first books I read that is a contemporary romance that has made me actually love contemporary romances. I don't particularly enjoy them because they tend to be incredibly dramatic and focused on the sort of like drama of it all versus like the romance of it all, and this feels more like a modern take on a rom-com, and I really love that feel. I like that it's a little fluffier, I like that it's romantic, I like that it's sweet. This was just an incredibly fun read. My only real critique with this one is that it is an incredibly quick turn to love, purely because they start as like antagonists. Like they start a little bit antagonistic, and I don't love that romance trope, and so I wish that we would have had a little bit longer time with them to get them to the friend level to then get them to love. But it is a romance, and I am very much in the minority when it comes to like enemies to lovers or antagonistic lovers, so I will chalk that up to that's my own personal preference, and I still absolutely love this book. I still give this book 5 stars because it's just so incredibly good, and I absolutely loved it. So there you have it. That's part 1 of my March wrap-up. I was very lucky to have read a lot of really great things this month so far. Let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books, if you agree with my thoughts, if you disagree, if there's any books that you think I should add to a future TBR, please let me know in the comments below. But as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope that you have a fantastic day.